Digital 410 Media proudly presents the What's the Scuttlebutt podcast with your hosts, Don Abernathy, Jeff Copsetta, and Dennis Blocker.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the What's the Scuttlebutt podcast, your favorite World War II based podcast. And Dennis and I are back for another episode, and we're happy to sit down with Laura Tohe to discuss Code Talkers, her father, and what she does for a living, her passion, and the importance of basically carrying on a family's legacy, family tradition, if you will. Dennis, how you doing, friend?
Doing great. Doing excellent. Getting after it.
Welcome, Laura. Thanks for joining us from the beautiful state of Arizona.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So give us a little brief synopsis on yourself, where you grew up, and your family, and how you got to the great career you have here. I mean, you're an author, a poet. The book you wrote in 2012, Code Talkers Stories.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I grew up on the Navajo Nation homeland in New Mexico and Arizona. And at the time when I was in school, like my father, we were forbidden to speak our language, Navajo language. So I went to school there, and then eventually I made my way to the city in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and went to school there, graduated, and went to the university there. And then I decided I would move on to get a more advanced degree. So I moved to the Midwest with my family, and I got both of my graduate degrees in Nebraska. And this book that I wrote was partly something that I was personally interested in because my father, who was a code talker, didn't speak very much about being in the military. We knew he was a Marine, but he didn't say he was a code talker until many years later. So after I moved here to Arizona, to Tempe, was teaching at the university, Arizona State University in Tempe, and I was asked to write a book on the Code Talkers by Rio Nuevo Press. And I had to put it off for a few years because I was working on another project. So I started working on that from about 2008 till 2011, going to interview the last remaining Code Talkers and some of their descendants.
Well, that was a question I was going to ask you. With it being 2008 and that timeline, did you at a certain point kind of feel the pressure, like you were fighting the clock because of obviously the age of these gentlemen and the lack of people available left to interview?
Yes, most of them by then were probably in their 80s. Some of them were still active. They did form an association years after they were discharged, and I went to their meetings to ask them if they would be interested in having me interview them for this book. And most of them said yes. So I did that, and they were most of them were really interested in giving their story because it was part of their legacy. And the fact that my father had been a code talker, they seemed open to that. And I also spoke my language to them because fortunately I was still able to retain my language in school. So I was able to speak to them in Navajo. And some of the code talkers gave their stories partly in Navajo and partly in English. And some gave it completely in English, but everything was translated into English for the book because I wanted the next generation of Navajo youth to have a text that they could read in their own language.
One of the questions I was thinking when I was thinking about our conversation earlier today is obviously the importance of carrying on our family legacy, but Indigenous people, obviously you guys rely heavily in preserving your culture. When it comes to preserving and handing down that culture in 2025 with all the battles of technology, phones, interference, and all that, become tougher nowadays in modern time versus even a short 15, 20 years ago? Because technology has changed so drastically. And even I was at a family dinner last night, and all my nieces and nephews, they're all just sitting on their phones, even though they're sitting next to each other. It's just the communication breakdown, it's insane.
It's the same way with the Navajo people, or Diné people, as we call ourselves too. And I can only speak for that tribe. It is a problem to try to save our language, because the Navajo language now is endangered. When I went to school in first grade on the Navajo Nation homeland, most of the students still spoke Navajo, and some didn't speak English, and I was bilingual, so I used to translate for them. And of course, because of the assimilation policy that the government had put forth, Native youth in the schools were not allowed and were punished for speaking their language. And so I was able to translate for them. Now, if you walk into a classroom in any of the schools on the reservation, you'll find the opposite, that there are more English speakers than there are Navajo speakers. We do have programs, that are trying to preserve the language, but the problem is the language is not spoken in the home.
Sure.
So if you learn the language in school and you take it home, there might not be anyone there that can converse with you in Navajo. So it's really hard to retain the language. And then we also have the internet, like you say, that's largely in English. Everything is largely in English now, and not a lot in Navajo. So it's really a difficult task to try to save our language.
Yeah, I was kind of wondering, has there been any sort of concerted effort on the part of tech companies or even AI to basically create any sort of translation dictionary or dialogue to translate from English or Spanish into Navajo, like there are with just a lot of the other languages?
Yeah, there are language programs available now, which you can get online, or you can actually buy a language program. And then online, there are some Navajo people, mostly I think there are some youth that are doing things like Navajo language word a day, or you can go and ask for a translation in Navajo and vice versa. But still, it's very difficult to try to wholeheartedly grasp this language, because it's so different than a
Yeah.
Western language, and the pronunciation is difficult for a lot of non-Navajo speakers, even Navajo speakers that don't speak the language. The speaking is difficult, because it's not anything like English. But there are others, that are some of the other Navajo people are trying to keep the language alive, keep it going. But like I said, it's a very difficult task.
I'll be honest with you. I was surprised when you said that when you were in school, there was still the prohibition on using your language. We knew about when your father was in school, and prior to that, the government restrictions on that. I guess naively, I would have kind of assumed that after the war and the use and the contribution of the Navajo people towards American, the government and the code, that they would lax up on that. But then in my mind, I'm like, oh yeah, the old phrase runs at the speed of government. So it makes perfect sense that they wouldn't have quickly turned around and changed those policies anytime soon.
Yeah, and I think that's the ironic thing, because when my father was in school, he wasn't allowed to speak Navajo. In fact, he ran away from his school in Santa Fe, and then he went into the service, and then he was a code talker. And when I interviewed some of the code talkers, they were astounded that in school they were told not to speak the language, and then they got into the Marines, and then they were told, now you're going to develop a language that you can use as a code. And they were astounded because on the one hand, they were coming from an institution that was punishing them for speaking Navajo and then moving into the military where they were told, you're going to speak your language. So when my father entered the service, he was still coming from those kinds of schools. Then when I entered schools in the late 50s, that policy was still in effect. And it's largely a result of these residential schools that we've lost our language.
Now, I don't want to paint a wide swath because I don't know. I know some of those schools were heavily religious based, and not only did they not want you to speak your language, but they didn't want them to practice their religion and their cultural beliefs. Were most of the schools that way, or was that just a select few?
Most of the schools were like that. It was the government and parochial schools that were on the Navajo reservation at the time, and both schools worked to erase indigenous culture, language, spiritual beliefs. Even the names were changed. That was the policy of the government towards Native peoples, to make Native people over into the white man's image, as it's been spoken of like before. So that was the reason why these schools were still operating like that when I got there in the late 50s. And it wasn't until probably the late 60s, early 70s, those policies changed. So my dad and these co-talkers were coming from schools where they were punished if they spoke in school or near the school. So they would have to leave this campus and they could speak freely there. But for the most part, I think these schools created a sense of, there was a sense of feeling like you cannot really express yourself. You could not really
Sure.
be who you were. You could not really identify yourself as an indigenous person because of the erasure that was going on throughout many years.
I don't know if there's a way to quantify or even answer this without actually asking someone who experienced it, but do you think what transitioning from that childhood, going to these schools, being forced to act a certain way, talk a certain way, do you think the transition from civilian life into boot camp, once they got, inducted into this program, because obviously boot camp, for all intents and purposes, it's the same way. It's all about, acting a certain way, following policies, get things done so you can survive in a war environment through discipline and following orders to a T in an effort to get you to hopefully survive what you're going to go through. It makes me wonder if kind of having an early childhood, more extreme version of that, obviously, to being following hard set of rules, doing this while you're on campus to now you're in boot camp, whereas some of their brothers, if you will, from throughout the country who are going through boot camp now, maybe they from New York City or Chicago or small farm towns where they didn't have that, with the exception of religion and maybe overbearing parents, but they didn't have that government mandated enforcement on their identity. I wonder if that kind of made that transition a little more, I don't want to say easy, but just normalized for them.
Well, I think that's a good point that you're making, a good question, because I think because the code talkers were not only coming from these schools that were really fashioned after military life, from Richard Henry Pratt, who built the first boarding school in Pennsylvania, the schools that my father and that I went to were still largely under that same kind of instruction and same kind of discipline, the same kind of doing things in a military way. So I remember when I was at the Albuquerque Indian School, we had a bell that would ring at 6 a.m, and we'd have to get up and go do our detail, as we call it. Some work in the kitchen, some work cleaning the dorm. And then we had to get ready for school, take a bus, come back. And it was pretty much regimented like a military institution. So my father, and I think some of the other code talkers, they were coming from backgrounds where they were already, I think, in many ways prepared for military life. For one thing, um, many of the families were very poor, so they didn't have much to eat. They didn't have much money, didn't have automobiles, so they were not able to go places like other, like people from outside the reservation could. So they were able to survive boot camp because they would be sent on, I guess I remember one of the code talkers talking about how he had to take a backpack and walk for miles without stopping, without food or without water. It was a really harsh training. And so because they were already coming from these backgrounds, they were already prepared in that way. And not only that, when they started to learn the code, there were over 450 words they had to learn and memorize. They could not have any kind of cheat sheets. Everything had to be stored up in their memory. And I think they used the Navajo oral tradition where stories and songs and prayers were memorized. And so I think in that way, they were also prepared for military life. And they also marched in school when they were in these residential boarding schools. They were already accustomed to marching. And I was in one of these schools in first grade. I had to march with my classmates from my classroom to the dining hall.
Wow.
And the principal put on a John Philip Sousa march over the
Wow.
over the loudspeaker. So
I can
that's
hear the needle scratching now.
Yeah, and it's and at the time, we did that, and those code talkers that were from those schools did the same thing too. So when they got into the military, it was not a big stretch for them.
It makes sense because I know, and Dennis knows, we've heard stories of young men who served in the civilian concentrated corps before joining the military because the civilian conservation corps kind of had that same military aspect and leadership. And perfect example, Wild Bill Garnier of the Easy Company fame, he served in that as a teenager before joining the military. And we've all heard stories where that transition kind of gave those guys a leg up, if you will. And a lot of those guys, because of that early early normalization in their lives of that structure helped them transition to boot camp and thus get more NCO roles, sergeants and corporals quicker than their counterparts. Second thing, as far as the code talkers and once they get into boot camp and the long marches, correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of their families they were sheep herders, right? And so spending an inordinate amount of time outside on foot, traveling and, tending to the sheep, they're probably quite familiar with spending long times out in the outdoors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. Many of the families owned herds of sheep, and they would have to herd the sheep sometimes long distance to get to water or to for feed. But also, as I mentioned, because many of the families didn't have automobiles, they had wagons, and I'm talking about the old, the wooden wheel wagons.
Stagecoach style.
Yes, and they had to hook them up to a team of horses or mules as transportation. So families needed to get somewhere. They used that means of transportation. So they could do that, or they could walk, hitchhike, or pretty much maybe catch a ride. But for the most part, the Navajo people were used to walking. They were used to daily physical exercise. In the late summer, because they didn't have modern conveniences like electricity and running water in their homes, they had to prepare for the coming winter. So what that meant was they had to hook up a team of horses or mules to the wagon and drive it up to the mountains and chop down the wood. And that might take, days or weeks.
Sure.
They'd come back and then chop the wood up and bring it inside. So that part was very labor intensive, and also with water, they had these huge barrels and they would take the wagon over to the water source and then bring that home. And then someone would have to bring that in. When I grew up with my grandmother, she was still living like that. We had to chop wood, bring it in, start the fire, and cooked with a wooden stove, and
Wow.
bring the water in by buckets into the house. And it was a harsh existence, but when I was a kid, it seemed like a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Because on my mother's side, when I was growing up, we had electricity and we had running water, so it was a different kind of existence. And I learned a lot about water conservation, that you can't just uselessly throw water out or play with it, as we were told. Don't play with the water.
As we get older, we look back on some of the hardships we had as kids, and we realize, as horrible as it was, that it played an important role. And give you an example, I kind of understood what that felt like because my parents got divorced when I was in second grade, and so I lived two different styles of livelihoods depending if it was the school year and I was living with my father in Columbus, Ohio. He was working his way up, making more money, whereas my mom in northern Kentucky, she was more of a free spirit, if you will, and depending on her current relationship with my grandmother dictated on whether or not she lived in a single wide trailer on 5 acres of land from the 70s or she lived in a one-bedroom shack with no indoor plumbing on the other end from the 1920s. And so some summers I would stay with her in the shack with an outhouse, no indoor plumbing, bathing in the Ohio River. And as you said, we were capturing water from our rain gutter in a 5-gallon drum to use to wash dishes and mop the floor, and then drive to the gas station to buy bottled water or go to a relative's house. Or if we were luxury and living in the single wide trailer, we still conserved water because when in 1991 money, when you're paying $60, $70 for a water truck to come fill up your cistern full of water, it wasn't, there were rules in place of how often you flushed a toilet, or, how we took a lot of naval showers, as my grandfather called it. When we were kids, it was, you don't run water. When we were like 4 or 5, 6, we'd go in the bathroom, turn on the sink, lather up the soap, and then wash ourselves off. And so, yeah, it's interesting how that comes to play as an adult. Like, yeah, that was horrible then, but sometimes you look back and like, I'm kind of glad I went through that because it makes me appreciate what we have now and understand the importance of water conservation or not wasting food, or what it's like to have to burn your trash because you can't afford the trash man to come out to the country to pick it up, and the importance of separating your combustibles from the paper.
Yeah. It sounds like you grew up on the res.
Yeah, a little bit. Just, yeah, it depended. Apropos to nothing, I just remember, living in that cabin one year, and my mom asked my brother, "Hey, defrost the pork chops." So he set them out on the picnic table, and the cats ran off with them because he didn't occur to him to put them up on the counter because we were just defrosting them. Which put them, instead of putting them on the counter, he put them on the picnic table out in the Kentucky sun, and the cats ran off with them. So no dinner that night.
Yeah.
Dr. Tohe, as I interviewed between 2002 and 2016, probably maybe 400 World War II veterans, and a lot of their names, when I see their names, even now on a 3x5, I'm immediately transported to a time sitting at their house on their couch, with their wife brings in a saucer with ice cream and a silver spoon for us, and I'm wondering if you have any of those kind of memories sitting there with the guys. If you could maybe set the scene for us of what some of those interviews look like, and did you have a tape deck and a video recorder or a digital how did you what did that look like?
Yeah. I worked with a photographer, Deborah O'Grady, who took the portraits of the code talkers we interviewed. And we started out by going to Gallup, New Mexico, where the code talkers met once a month. And I was able to get on their program and explain to them what I wanted to do with this book that I was doing, and they were wanting to do it. They were willing to do it in that time. I took their names down and got their phone numbers and set it up like that. And then I got instructions, because on the reservation, we don't have street names. There are road names, but street names are pretty much non-existent. So I got a lot of instructions on or instructions to home on scrap paper and napkins. So it's different kind of research where it's like, well, when you get to Crown Point, go down Highway X and then look for the tire on the side of the road.
That's great.
Turn right there and go 2 miles and go to the sheep camp. So it was that kind of thing. I've been used to that. I was used to those kind of instructions. So I'd go to their homes and would set up the equipment, and I had a recorder and for just recording the voice, and then I also had a camera for the visual part of it.
Mm-hmm.
Then my collaborator took photographs as talkers were.
That's amazing.
And it was amazing, the stories that they told about their life before joining the military, when they were growing up, and then what they did during the military, and then what they did afterwards. And it was all very interesting. And I spent a whole day with mostly all the code talkers. One code talker, I spent 2 days with him. And he just told me story after story after story. And they were amazing stories. And he told me some things I had never knew that they had to do. Like this man, this code talker, said that he used to have to water ski from the ship to land and back and forth to deliver ammunition. And I had never heard that before. And he just told me all these amazing stories. So I spent most of the time, maybe several hours with each code talker, listening to their story and trying not to intrude in any way. Yeah. And the thing that worked best for me was when I went out to their home, and all I had said was, tell me a story about being a code talker. And that's all I said. And then they just started talking and talking and talking. And everything was transcribed at the end into English and to Navajo. And then as part of, a small gift to them, we gave each of them a color portrait. I think it was like a 4x6, or no, it's actually larger than that, maybe 8x10. I think it was pretty large. Forget the size of it. And a book. And then I also gave them gift cards for gas, because I believe that when someone tells you a story, it's like a gift, and you have to pay for it in some way. So that was our way of payment. And most of the code talkers were very gracious, invited us to their home. Unfortunately, only one code talker invited us for lunch. So we didn't get the ice cream or anything like that. But yeah, and it was very interesting. I enjoyed doing this research because it was my own people, my own father's generation that I was interviewing. And because my father didn't tell us much about being a code talker, I was very curious. And through the code talker stories that I heard, I was able to get a better idea of what he did while he was in the service in the war. And some of them talked about having to be in a foxhole for days filled with water, being shot at after they sent a message on the radio waves, and then having to sometimes to run alone to take a message to another officer. Things that, I wondered about my own father. And through those stories, I was able to get some idea of what my father did because I have photos of him when he first joined the military at 16. And then towards the end of the war, I have a photo of him and he just looks completely different.
Mhm.
Did he have to get your grandparents to sort of approve his early joining in the Marine Corps, or did he just go in?
Well, my father was actually 16 when he enlisted, but there were ways around enlisting, and he was able to get his parents um, permission to enlist because there was a form that said that he'd written down that he was 17, and his parents approved that and said, okay, yeah, we'll let you join. So he was actually 16 when he was enlisted, but said he was 17. And I had heard the code talkers say there were others that did that too.
It's such a contrast to think not only your father and his fellow code talkers, but we know across the world 16, 17-year-olds were signing up to fight for their particular government and homeland. And then it juxtapose that to nowadays, or you ask a 16-year-old to take out the trash and mow the grass, and it's just arguing and how different things are between then and now.
Yeah, for sure.
How does someone sign up, and fight for the country's one thing, but for a government who treated them the way they were? We discussed earlier about, trying to have your culture and your religion and your whole identity taken from you, forced from you through these schools to now, as you said earlier, the irony of, hey, that thing we didn't want you to do, well, we really need it now. How does one get over their own resentment and say, you know what, I'm down for this cause, let's go?
Mhm. Yeah, I was wondering about that myself, and some of the code talkers talked a little bit about that. And I think because this was a different generation, they had very strong feelings about serving in the military because in the Navajo culture, we have warriors who protect the family, the community, who also go to war against their enemies. So that was already there. And I think from my father's generation, they talked about how they acknowledged that there was this very complicated um, relationship between the United States, what's now the United States, and Navajo people and indigenous people. But they still felt that they needed to help the country because they didn't want to be under another government. They didn't want the Japanese or the Germans to invade this land. And so they felt it was their responsibility. That's the main theme that I got from their reasons for enlisting, is that they felt their responsibility to enlist despite, the wars and the battles and the removals and colonization and boarding schools. They still felt it was partly their responsibility to help protect the land. And they spoke about it not in terms of, I went to war to protect the Navajo people. They were saying, I'm enlisted because I wanted to protect the country, and it's the people that live here. And I thought that was so honorable that, that was their thinking, despite everything else. But, that was one of the things that they did talk about, was it was a way for them to help the country when it was needed.
I
And
just
right after Pearl Harbor was bombed, that some of them were still in school, and they heard about this attack of Pearl Harbor over the radio, and they were already talking about enlisting.
When you said that, I literally got cold chills, because the thing I was going to say is, if I could be so bold, if one thing we could take from what you just said that we could truly use in 2025 is that we need to realize there's a difference between our country and the country's people and our government. And, we'd all get along a lot better if we kind of separated the fact that we're all Americans living here as a group of people, and then there's the government, and we're not exactly one and the same. I think we would all benefit truly from that. But Dennis, go ahead with another follow-up question. Oh, you're muted, I think.
Yeah, sorry, I
There you
muted.
go. No worries.
The dog is I've been whining. But Dr. Tohe, have you read Empire of the Summer Moon?
I'm sorry, speak that.
Yes, it's a book called Empire of the Summer Moon.
Oh, no, I haven't.
It's a book written by um, an author named Dwyer, and it talks about the Comanche Nation and the Kiowa, and I'm in Texas, so that was fully covered by our history and growing up as kids, and they were very prominent in our history books. Even the names of some of the counties that we have, and streams and whatnot are named after them, and some of their leaders. Um, that book really, and I recommend it to folks, but it really touched my heart, and it was, yeah, you hear that sigh. It makes you, yeah, it makes you really think about a lot of things about um, the moment that the Europeans first set foot on the continent, that it was a done deal. And no matter from what happened from that point on, unfortunately, the word was out, and it was over at that moment. And it's just, it's such a great read about the struggles and the fighting to maintain their identity and to against just insurmountable odds. And then yet, when it was all over, the ability to dust off and say, okay, well, let's build something great. And I couldn't help but when I would watch Adam. I worked in the emergency room for 23 years, and everybody who's listens to the podcast probably right now is rolling their eyes because I talk about this a lot. But it's a very important to me, especially when I'm dealing with PTSD and all the World War II guys that I interviewed, and I would ask them about it. And I think the fact that my grandpa was with them in these campaigns probably helped. But also, I would be very open with them about the fact that I had worked EMS and emergency room trauma team for 23 years. And I had seen a lot of death, and more than most people ever will. And I would talk to them openly about my struggles with PTSD. And I couldn't help but reflect on when you were talking, and you were talking about the walking all the time, walking here and walking there, and how that was part of the culture. And I remembered Ira Hayes, who had walked all the way to South Texas to talk to Harlan Block's mom, and just to tell her that he was in the picture, and the ghosts that Ira had to face, and the PTSD that he dealt with, and how the time that I saw Flags of Our Fathers, how it didn't really touch me in the way it did until I had my own battles with PTSD and almost taking my life. And then seeing Flags of Our Fathers and seeing Adam Beach just, I got full goosebumps right now. I mean, his portrayal of Ira Hayes, it just makes me even cracks in my voice right now. It's beautiful, and it makes me think about your dad and those guys and the character of those men, real men who stood up for a country like Don was talking about, and they put it all on the line. And I just have so much admiration for them, and I can't help but be proud of you, Dr. Tohe, for fulfilling your family's tradition of carrying on the oral history. And you took it to the next level, and now it's preserved for all time. And no matter what happens now, it's preserved. And I, I'm very, very proud of you because I know how much work it is and how much time it takes. And I know that you get immersed in it. And I know you fall in love with the guys and then they pass away. I know that responsibility that's on you. And to this day, it's been all those years and you're still telling that story. And that just gives me goosebumps. I appreciate you very much and what you did and continue to do. I know that's not much of a question, but these are just some of the things that when you were speaking that were these thoughts that were just circling around in my head as a guy who cares very deeply about history and who has great respect for the nations. And yeah, that's pretty much it, Don, for me. I'm sorry. I'm such an admirer of what you've done, Dr. Tohe. And
Oh,
did your
thank
dad
you.
ever get to see your final product? Did he get to see? I don't know
Talker
that.
story.
Yeah, I don't know
My
that part of
father,
the story.
my father passed in 1994,
Okay,
so
so
he
no, he
was not
didn't.
able to.
Yeah.
And yeah, if he had still been alive, I would have interviewed him. Um, but I wanted to comment a little bit on the history that you were mentioning. This history of the code talkers is pretty much not known very much.
Yeah.
And this is not, I mean, this is really part of the way I think I grew up as well. In school, if we had history, there was maybe a paragraph or a page, 2 pages on Indigenous history. So I didn't learn anything about military history in this case because there was nothing there. Our stories were invisible. And now it's with DEI, last spring, the links to the code talkers, the Tuskegee Airmen, and the service that women gave were removed from the Department of Defense. And that was just unbelievable
I
because
I knew nothing about that. I'm completely shocked at, that the assumption would be made that the Tuskegee Airmen and code talkers was a DEI
yeah,
policy. That's insane.
yeah, it is. I
Heartbreaking.
mean, it was pretty, it was something that was really hard to believe because many of the people of color and women who contribute service to this country, their stories were completely taken off the Department of Defense.
Wow.
And there were people, including myself, that let others know, and we voiced our feelings about this, and some of the links were put back on there.
That's something.
But the way that I think that we feel is that, our stories were pretty much non-existent, or there was just very little there, and then to have those links removed was another way of erasure, not just
Yeah.
language, but military service erasure for Indigenous peoples. And also, the PTSD, I think, is also a big part of military, the military families, I think, because I think when we talk about PTSD, I had two brothers that were in Vietnam. Well, one of my brothers was in Vietnam. He was special services, and his job was to parachute into the jungles where Agent Orange had been sprayed.
Oh,
Goodness
wow.
gracious.
And another brother served in Germany. He didn't go to Vietnam. But my brother that did jump into the jungles suffered greatly from PTSD. He was never able to recover what he brought back from Vietnam to this country. I remember my mother and grandmother said that he would have nightmares and wake up screaming or yelling. And he became an alcoholic and died very early, 40 years of age.
Sorry to hear that. And he had the
Man.
disgusting, unfortunate double whammy of not only dealing with the PTSD of what he experienced over there, but then coming home to how society and pop culture treated Vietnam vets. So he got, coming home trying to deal with the things he witnessed and experienced over there, trying to compartmentalize that and process it to come home and deal with what they were dealing with at the airports and on TV and in music. It's just, I just couldn't imagine.
And it was, the era where they were not told, thank you for your service. It was the complete opposite
Yep.
of that.
Yeah.
But my brother, he maybe if he had had a ceremony, because Navajo people have an enemy way ceremony, and one of its uses is to treat PTSD.
Mm.
And some veterans who have PTSD have sometimes had these ceremonies done for them. And it's a very long and intense ceremony that takes many days. And there is some research that shows that those that have had these kinds of ceremonies can transform their lives and come back to their communities and to
Absolutely.
their families.
Is there ayahuasca a part of that?
I don't know.
I know that there's a lot of research right now
Yeah, currently.
with ayahuasca and the the indigenous use of that, and how that it was such a transformative experience, and they've been doing tests like that, and actually I can't believe I'm even seeing this happen in Texas, but they're actually going to legalize under medical direction the use of those substances for veterans and people with PTSD, because they've had such great, as exactly as you said, transformative experiences, almost bordering on spiritual, that they're tapping into something that is very unique.
Yeah, I think they're like super micro dosing hallucinogens and psychedelics in a way to help treat PTSD in soldiers. And I know that's been something that they've been really making headway in, and they're actually getting legit scientific papers instead of, subculture stuff. There's been grants in colleges and firms actually looking into the beneficial of microdosing hallucinogens and trying to help untangle some of those thought processes. Real quick before we wrap it up, you mentioned in 1968 they kind of released the paperwork on the code talkers, and then in 2001 the original 29 code talkers received a congressional gold medals, and in 2002 the code talkers recognition act was passed. Do you remember how that impacted your community in 2000 or 2001 when word came out that they're finally, getting a more broad recognition,
Mm.
at a governmental level for the things that they did in the 40s?
Yeah, I think that was during the Bush administration. Um, it was actually Ronald Reagan that proclaimed National Code Talker Day earlier. And when the Code Talkers went to Washington and were honored for this, it was in the tribal newspapers. And I think people were very proud of that they were finally getting the recognition that
Mm.
they had earned. And I know it's no small thing because, these were men who put their lives down and said, I will go to war and I will give over my life to the government so I can help the country. So it was something that I think the Navajo people were very um, happy about, celebrated. And in 2001, the Navajo Nation also honored all the code talkers, including the
Mm,
ones that were deceased in Window Rock, Arizona. And I went for my father. He had already passed by then, but all the Navajo code talkers showed up with their family. It was a huge
mm,
celebration. They were
wow.
recognized, they were given medals, and it was a beautiful day because we got together and said, these are our people. They went to war not just for us but for everyone.
Yes.
And every August 14th, the Navajo people celebrate Navajo Code Talker Day in Window Rock, Arizona.
Mm,
Just had one in
That's
August.
fantastic.
that's cool.
And it's a day of now. There's only two code talkers left today, Thomas Begay and Peter McDonald,
Wow.
and they no longer can do speaking engagements. They're in wheelchairs now, um, but they were remembered and celebrated throughout the Navajo Nation. I think different communities had their own day for that. But I also want to mention that it was not just the Navajo people that had code talkers, there were
Mm,
other tribes as well. The Hopi was another tribe from Arizona who were code talkers, Comanche, um, I believe Sac and Fox, some of the Sioux tribes. Um, I think there was maybe at least a dozen code talkers, tribal code talkers from different nations that um, enlisted and served in World War One and World War Two.
wow.
Did they use their own native language for their code?
Yes.
Which makes sense because the military is all about redundancy, right? So if the Navajo or one of them gets hacked or cracked, if you will, then you have redundancy through the other languages and the other code talkers. So that makes perfect sense. But yeah, that's not a phrase, when you hear code talkers, you just automatically associate it with the Navajo people. So it's very important to get that.
Dr. Tohe, before we call it, I have one more question for you. Where have you placed all of your talks and recordings and transcripts? Have you placed those in a museum, or do you still have those? Or what's your plans for those if you haven't placed them yet? Where will historians in the future be able to
Yeah.
refer to those?
Well, since I was a professor at Arizona State University in Tempe for many years, I'm planning on donating my papers
Hmm.
to the university. Um, I was asked to donate them to one of the museums in Washington, D.C., but I think it was a little too far for some Native peoples to go to Washington or people that were
Mm,
interested.
yes,
So I thought it would be better to just donate the papers locally. So that's probably what I'll start working on. And yeah, so people will be able to see this research, um, the written text and the oral text, and then the visual text that will be
that's
located
awesome.
there.
That
That's
makes perfect
perfect.
sense to keep it close
Yeah,
to home opposed to, making people travel to see it.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's awesome.
Real quick, one last question. No Parole Today, the book you put out in 1999. I know it addresses some of the boarding school experiences. That's that you won a poetry award for. Was that based on your boarding school experiences and the things that you went through?
Yes, that was me. It was I've spoken from the viewpoint of a young girl who starts out in a boarding school on the reservation and then goes to a boarding school off reservation in Albuquerque, New Mexico, in the 60s and late 60s and early 70s. Yeah, that was largely my story, but it's really a larger story of not only just my life, but other students who were there and what we went through in these institutions that were willing or wanting to wipe our identity out, as I mentioned earlier.
Mm, man, goodness.
Oh yeah, and that is also available on Amazon. So for those y'all listening, obviously you want to pick up the Code Talker stories, but if you want, we've mentioned it here and then on previous episodes about the boarding schools and all that. So if you guys want to get a firsthand account of that. Even it still surprises me that that was still going on in the 50s, in the 60s.
Oh yeah.
It's just
Mhm.
once again, it's the speed of government. And I can imagine that the policies on reservations weren't really at the top of government's mind on things to update and to review. I'm sure a lot of stuff were probably holdover from 20 years prior to whatever current date you were looking at stuff. So yeah, check out No Parole Today as well. That's on Amazon along with Code Talker Stories. Thank you so much. We've greatly
Yes,
enjoyed
thank you
this.
so much.
And if you
Thank
have
you for thank you for inviting me. I appreciate this opportunity to share what my father and the code talkers did during World War II.
That's awesome.
Yeah, one of our listeners reached out to me on Facebook, said, with the exception of the movie that we're not big fans of, you guys really need to do some context and do some shows on code talkers. And so that's what we've been trying to do to help get the word out there. And thanks so much for bringing up the fact that the code talkers and the Tuskegee Airmen and some of the women's auxiliary pilots links were taken down off the Department of Defense. I had no idea. And for Jeff's not here, but for three guys who's basically their reading and extracurricular activities are based around World War II stuff, and that didn't even come up in our hemisphere, is just kind of showing how it was just kind of done quietly in the dark. So thank you so
It's
much for
terrible.
pointing that out.
Yes.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah.
This has been a Digital 410 production.